Safety is an interesting thing. We create safety when we're able to make and meet commitments. We create safety when everybody knows the rules. We create safety when we get to be connected to each other, and we create safety when we get to have fun together. This idea of psychological safety is big in the Agile community. So what are the conditions that have to be created so everybody gets the psychological safety that they need, all four of the different quadrants? How are you guys doing today? Okay, so why did you guys come to a culture talk? What do you want to hear about? Culture? Oh, well, I guess that makes sense. Okay, I walked myself into that one. Anybody have any thoughts? Like, what challenges are you guys experiencing with culture? No?
I think
Okay, go ahead.
people saying they want the culture to change and then doing things that are very counterproductive to changing.
Yeah. Well, kind of the backdrop to this talk is I've been playing around in the Agile world for about 20 years. My first job, I grew up in like project management, PMO, right? So that was kind of all my background. Had a degree in computer science, but like never really used it professionally. So I've just worked in IT fields and did infrastructure and B2B, B2C, e-commerce, large-scale financial systems and stuff like that. And when I first started getting into Agile, it was like all the books, think like 2003, 2004, all the books were like on small team Scrum. And we really kind of hadn't hit the culture thing yet, but then like everything started being about creating a culture of agility. And like I'm doing like big mainframe systems and Oracle databases and online banking and bill pay. And I just had this like nagging thing in my head is like, how is culture going to lead to this project that I have to deliver? Or how is Scrum going to lead to this project that I had to deliver? And so back in those days, this was before the books on SAFe. Most everything at that point was XP or Scrum, I guess like feature-driven development and DSDM. Anybody remember that one? Yeah, it's been a minute of DSDM, right? So those are like the things that were around, right? So we were all trying to sort it out. And read David Anderson's first book on, I think it's basically his first book on Kanban. It was like lean theory of constraints applied to Agile. And so developed some really strong points of view about how to do Agile at scale and really just kind of hit everything hard from like a process and like an organizational structure. Leading Agile, my company, which I started about 14 years ago, basically do like transformation work, so like getting into really large, complicated companies, trying to figure out how to untangle them. And then it was like through my last 20 years, kind of circled back to the culture side. And so what this talk's going to be is a little bit around like what I think's important in order to be able to kind of establish the kind of culture that you might want in an organization, okay? And so the way that I structure this talk, I'll go through a couple introductory slides. So if anybody wants the deck, you can text culture to that little thing and my team will send you a link to it and you can download it. I'll put that back up at the end as well, so if you miss it. That's my contact information if anybody ever wants to reach out or connect with me on LinkedIn or Facebook, or probably not Facebook, but I guess, yeah, well, you can find me on LinkedIn, it's fine, that's cool, right? Yeah, but anyway, what we're gonna do during this talk is I'm gonna kind of start with the end of the story, and then I'm gonna tell you the story, and then we're gonna go back to the first couple slides and kind of reiterate why I thought those first couple slides were important. So, long title for a talk, but basically my general point of view is that you kind of have to get the organization right and in alignment if you want to create the kind of culture you want. So it's like the fundamental structure, systems, things like that are necessary to create a culture that you want. And so I'm going to unpack that a little bit with you. And so I talk a lot about the idea that there's like three different ways to kind of think about Agile and Agile transformation. And the first one, like I said, that I encountered was this idea of practices. And so we're all, I'm sure, familiar with Scrum. Maybe some of us are familiar with like XP and all the engineering practices that are associated with it. Now we have SAFe, we have Spotify model, we have large-scale Scrum, things like that. What I find most of the time when we go in to talk to people, we'll get comments that say something like, Scrum's working really well for us, but like we can't produce any software. Like we're not sure kind of what's wrong, right? Anybody experience that? Yeah. Well, it was, I have to be careful as I get in the story, especially if you guys laugh at my jokes. It's like, I'm gonna like, everything in my being is gonna want to talk for an hour and a half, so I'm gonna try to keep it short. But it was almost as if like the daily stand-up meeting was like the reason we couldn't figure out how to build software, right? And so there's a lot of value in the practices of Scrum and XP and SAFe and all those kinds of things. But you're making like a jump, right? When you, like, we'll just pick on Scrum for a minute. You're making a jump that if you say, we're gonna start doing Scrum, the Scrum Master's gonna remove the impediments, what you're kind of saying is that the organizational structures and all the different things as the Scrum Master removes the impediments will kind of just happen. You're kind of making that jump. Or if we start doing Scrum, that all of a sudden leaders are going to be empowering and trust their teams and all those kinds of things, right? And in practice, I think we find that often that doesn't play out the way we want it to, okay? And then, so what we kind of do next is we go to this idea of, well, if those leaders would just trust us, if those leaders would just empower us, if they would just, if we could just adopt an Agile mindset, then that would create the space for the practices to work. And in reality, like what I see more often than not is that you walk into most organizations that are trying to do Scrum and we have matrix teams all over the place. We have dependencies between different teams. We have a disconnect from the person that's writing the backlog up into the product owner organization. Or there's a disconnect from the backlog up to the strategic objectives of the organization. And so kind of my premise in this talk is that if we want to create space for an Agile culture to emerge, we have to kind of put the stuff around that team in place so that people can trust each other, so that people can inspect and adapt, so that they can develop relationships, okay? So it's like all of the fun, goodness, sticky notes on the wall, connected teams that work together, I believe is a product of, at the small level, just a team that stays together over time with a clear backlog that can produce a working tested increment at the end of every sprint. Within that container, you can get a lot of teamwork and collaboration. When you have teams with a known backlog that can establish a stable velocity, that can put something maybe into production every 2 weeks, now that creates the safety for people to be vulnerable, to trust. When the organization starts to believe that the system works, the leaders will begin to empower that team and trust that team to evolve. Okay, so that's kind of like, that's the end of the talk, right? So everything else that I'm going to say over the next 40 minutes at this point is in support of that key point. So if we had more time, I would love to get some audience participation, but you know, we start to talk about like what is an Agile culture? Like what is it that we're looking for? And so these were just like the things that were top of mind for me. We want trust. We want the team to have ownership. We want the team to be empowered. We want an organization that can respond to change. We want people to be adaptive. We want solutions to emerge. We want to create safety. We want to have teamwork. Any other words come to mind when you think about the kind of cultures that we want to create? One or two? I leave anything out? Innovation, yeah, for sure. We want to be innovative. Common goals, right? All that kind of stuff. Yeah, 100%. Okay? So why is it important? Right? Well, this probably reflects my personality, because we're going to get into a lot of personality stuff too, because I'm incredibly fascinated with the idea of personality and how it impacts how we show up. But for me, things like building the right products, getting fast feedback, attention to quality, early delivery, predictability, efficiency, lower cost, innovation, right? But it could also be like, do I have fun at work? Do I feel connected? right? Do I feel like I get to make decisions? And that's a really interesting thing, because a lot of times when I go to conferences or even pick up some Agile books now and then, a lot of the focus is on the environment that the teams operate in. But most of the time when I go in and talk to executives, whether it's a client or somebody that I'm selling to or somebody at a conference, most of the time what people are trying to do with Agile is they're trying to get the organization to put things in market faster so they can charge money for them, right? And so sometimes there's like a disconnect or like a bridge that's missing between why the teams want to adopt Agile and why leadership wants to adopt Agile. So you got to get really clear on like what it is that you're doing with Agile and why you're doing it and what you want to accomplish with it. So then I kind of go into, well, okay, however we define culture, who's responsible for it, right? Who's responsible for making it happen? Sometimes it's we want to get the leaders on board. And again, all the thing, trust, empowerment, give us agency, let us make decisions, all that kind of stuff, right? So leadership clearly has some responsibility for it. But I would suggest that sometimes the teams have some responsibility too. Like, I'm very much a Stephen Covey guy. I think a lot about personal responsibility. Anybody familiar with Christopher Avery's stuff? Right, Christopher Avery was like one of the first Agile talks I ever like heard about 17 years ago. His books on responsibility process and personal ownership and things like that are just mind-blowing to me. So I think the teams have some responsibility for the culture that we're trying to create as well. This is one that I think is tough, is like, how do we get our customers to have like an Agile culture with us, right? I mean, sometimes we go in to do transformation work with folks and it's like some of the toughest places to work. And those are our customers, right? People that want to adopt Agile. Imagine if you're a company trying to adopt Agile and you want to get into this inspect and adapt, this collaborative, more exploratory kind of world with them, and they're like really strictly waterfall. Or maybe it's a partner company or something like that, right? And then the organization. So that's where I kind of get into this idea of, if an organization wants to really be Agile, it requires personal empowerment, it requires leadership, it requires some trust with your customers or vendors or suppliers, partners, that kind of a thing. But the organization has to be fundamentally set up for it as well, okay? And so this is like, to me, like such an interesting idea. I hope you guys find it as interesting as I do. But when I started really getting serious about thinking about, if we're gonna have a culture conversation and we're talking about moving parts of the organization, at the end of the day, I do think it largely comes down to the people that are in the organization. And as kind of a funny aside, about 6 years ago, I was working with a coach, and he turned me on to this personality assessment tool. I've got no skin in the game with it. I just happen to like it. Don't sell it. Not owner in it or anything. It was called the Color Code. Look it up sometime. Colorcode.com. It's based upon the same fundamental science as the DISC, but it's probably not as rigorous. But for me, it was super, super understandable. And you could imagine what it's like living with somebody, well, you don't know me that well, but it's like, imagine what it's like living with somebody like me. Whenever I get like excited about something like this, like I test it on my family. So like I have so many personality profiling tools on my family, because I'm kind of like, and my leadership team, because I think if something's interesting, I kind of want to know who you are, and then I want to see if the assessment kind of matches it. And this is the one that kind of lit up for me. Okay, and we're gonna connect some dots as we go here, but bear with me here for a second. What is that? Yellow. Well, am I yellow? Well, give me a minute. We'll talk. Well, I'll say. So basically, the model, it's really super easy to understand. Okay, and so it's like people are on like the vertical axis. I think is what I have here. Is they're controlling or non-controlling, logical or emotional. Okay, so you end up with basically 4 quadrants. You end up with a logically controlling quadrant, an emotionally controlling quadrant, you end up with a emotionally non-controlling quadrant, and you end up with a logically non-controlling quadrant. And when you start to think about it, right, you can kind of derive that. Like, it's, again, same science as the DISC, but like I can't ever remember what DISC means or whatever, right? It just doesn't stay in my head. But when I'm interacting with somebody, I can usually get a read on, are they controlling or not? Are they coming from a logical perspective or an emotional perspective? And we're all hybrids, right? We're all hybrids and mixes of different things. But people in this model that are dominant blue, okay, emotional controlling. My wife's emotionally controlling. That sounds really awful when you say that. But what it means is that we want everybody around us to be okay. We want to be in a relationship, right? We want to feel connected, right? And so an emotionally controlling person is going to be incredibly concerned about you and how you feel. And so we see leaders oftentimes in organizations that, that manifest like a dominant personality trait in that quadrant. They really care about their teams. They want their teams to be great, all that kind of stuff, okay? I'm really going to have to hurry up. Upper right, this is where I land, is kind of in the logical control. Okay, so again, systems, methodologies, results, performance, things like that. Has a dark side too, right? Kind of want things my way all the time, you know, and it can lead to some bad leadership traits. But up underneath that power is I want results, I want performance, and I want outcomes, that kind of thing. So that's how I'm wired, okay? Now, the lighter touch ones, the non-controlling people, so like I'm secondary yellow, and so yellow is fun. Right? I want to like the people I work with. I want to have fun relationships with people. I want to joke. I want to be irreverent, right? All that kind of stuff, right? I want to have fun. And then the white side, that's my wife's other half. So my wife and this model are considered non-complementary opposites, but we've been married 30 years, so we like figured it out, right? White is like peace. I want everybody to agree on the system. I want everybody to agree on the rules. And so when I started building this talk about 1.5 years ago, the fundamental epiphany that I had was that I think we all see culture through our own individual lens. Does that make sense? Okay. So I want a culture of performance where we get things done. Some people want a culture where they get to show up and hang out and have fun and go out for after drinks or play foosball or whatever in the office, right? That kind of a thing. Some of us really want that. I want to feel deeply connected to the people around us. And then some of us want to really operate in a clear-based rule system where there's not a whole lot of ambiguity, right? Not a lot of conflict, right? You guys buying my underlying premise so far? You see where I'm going at least? Okay. So I think it's really super interesting. So what I started thinking about, and we did this like in our company, like when we send out emails, like sometimes we'll go like, okay, does that email, does it address like all the different personality types, right? Are we creating opportunities within the organization for all of the different personalities to have the safety and experience that they want to have? And it's just really interesting when we start to think of culture is not this one monolithic thing that everybody agrees on, but it's this continuum. Right? So the things that like stuck in my head, so me and my team were collaborating on this, it's like, so when I think of a blue culture, I think of trust, empowerment, safety, appreciation, connection. All great stuff, right? A red culture is results, accountability, commitment, ownership, performance. Okay? Personal responsibility kind of stuff. Yellow culture, recognition, creativity, flexibility, collaboration, and fun. And white is balance, clear expectations, harmony, inclusion, autonomy. Again, just top of mind, right? This isn't part of the model or whatever. It's just my observation as I kind of get into and thought about this kind of a click or two deeper. Okay? So an ideal culture would create the space for all the personalities to get a little bit of what they want in an organization. And so successful systems maximize for all 4 of those views. And so what we want is we want a culture that incorporates all of it, or at least we're really clear on what aspects we're going to incorporate and make sure people are a good fit for the culture that we've decided to have. You know, people that work with me, for me, we're very much a red culture, red, yellow kind of culture. And I have to be really super mindful to be inclusive of people with other personality styles and be able to have conversations on this vector because different people value different things. I had this one lady that was, she was a product coach on my team, and she's like, I love working at Leading Agile because we have a system that we put in place. And I looked at her personality profile because I have an app on my phone. This is how much of a geek I have an app on my phone with all my employees. I can look up their personality profiles. And I do that before I talk to anybody on the phone. right? Because it's like, I want to know what angle you're coming at this from, right? So I can speak to you and what your concerns are. And I happen to know she was primary white. And I said, I bet you like our system because it makes all the rules clear, everybody understands what they're supposed to do, and it's kind of like a thing. And she's like, yes. And I'm like, you want to know why I like it? Because it gives me the ability to have control and make things happen, right? So it's like the same thing, but it was like two fundamentally different angles of personality that we were trying to kind of play against. So I thought that was kind of neat. And so that kind of got into, okay, so now we start talking about agile methodologies and what are we doing with these methodologies? And again, Scrum is just such a great example. Okay, so the stuff that I was talking about around the practices, that kind of appeals a lot to the white and to the red, right? So we have a structure that we do Scrum in. We do product, sprint planning. We do daily stand-ups. We do reviews and retrospectives. We have backlogs. We collaborate as a team. We do burn down charts or burn up charts, right? Whatever, right? There's a lot of people that really gravitate towards that. Sometimes we have people that get kind of control freaks with Scrum. It has to be a certain way, and it have to operate like this, and we have to produce it this way. And so what I think's neat about a framework like Scrum, if you can get it right and get it working, is that it actually creates kind of a container for all the different things that happen, right? So you think about it from a white perspective. It's got a rule set. Right? You think about it from a red perspective. If I know the size of my backlog, I know the velocity of my team, I get to the definition of done at the end of every sprint, then I can start to predict time and cost. I can start to communicate scope. I can start to communicate to the leaders what it is that I'm trying to build and when I'm going to get done building it. Now, for the other sides of it, right, a well-formed Scrum team can have a lot of fun, right? The daily stand-ups create an opportunity to get together, the whole game side of the Agile community. I don't have a whole lot of tolerance for playing games to learn stuff, even though I'm like secondary yellow. But you notice in our Agile community, it's like a lot of people index on games, right? And you can see that, right? It's totally yellow personality type. And it totally works within the Agile framework. Okay, and for the blue people, right, Scrum creates this container so that when I show up to work, I trust the people, I respect the people, I feel connected to the people, I get to know the people, all those kinds of things, right? And so when you start to think about Scrum as a kind of a holistic methodology to build the kinds of cultures that you want, right, it kind of has all the aspects in it. But one thing I'm going to get to a little bit, I'm going to cheat up just in case that I run out of time and have to clip the end of the talk because I'm talking too much. But what's neat about it is you think about what are the conditions that make Scrum work, that create the conditions so that all these different personalities can play out. So I had this one talk that I did probably 13, 14 years ago, first time. No, it couldn't have been that long, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, something like that. It's all blending together and getting old. But you think about it, right? So it comes down to me with Scrum is this idea of teams, backlogs, working tested software. It's like, you think about what a Scrum team is. It's like 6 to 8 people that stay on that team. Right? They work together. They establish a stable velocity together. The product owner is supposed to show up with a really clear, well-articulated backlog where you can get 3, 4, 5, 6 stories done every sprint. Things are broken down really, really small. We have the technical infrastructure and the dependency-free environment such that we can produce an increment that a product owner or a customer can validate at the end of every sprint. When we don't get the teaming strategies right, we don't get the ability to build the backlog right, we can't produce a working test and increment of software at the end of every sprint, you start to think about how that breaks down. The red people start to go towards command and control. We're going to project manage the Scrum team. That's where you start to get the project managers assigned to the Scrum teams managing everything, right? The white people are just hanging on for dear life to the rules of Scrum, right? Because that's what gives them safety. Right? Nobody's having any fun because it sucks to come to work and not have clarity and be pulled in 1,000 different directions. You never feel like you have anything. And the blue people are going well, what's the heck? If we were just nicer to each other, everything would work out, kind of a deal, right? So what the point that I'm kind of trying to make is that if we excuse me, if we don't get like the underlying framework of it, we don't understand how it works, we can't like lead the culture aspects of it that actually lead to it, right? And so telling people to be nice doesn't really work, right? Telling people that they have to deliver something come hell or high water, regardless of, quality of life or sustainable pace or any of those things, like that doesn't work. And so leaders just find themselves, they just put pressure on it and it just blows the culture out of the water. Like nobody's getting what they want out of it. And so this idea of structure first, like the practices don't do it, just establishing the culture doesn't do it. In Scrum, it's important that we have the teams, we have the mechanism for building the backlogs, we produce the working tested software, and then all 4 aspects of culture get satisfied simultaneously when we do that. Tracking? Make sense? Okay, cool. Does anybody do Spotify? I hear the word tribes and guilds and things all the time, but like I don't know if anybody, is it working for you? Like I heard Spotify doesn't even do Spotify. And Henrik Nieberg, the guy that kind of was the coach of Spotify when they were doing it, who kind of published this, he's just like, yeah, it was just a transitory thing we did. But the language has been like really super interesting. So if you look at like what Spotify was trying to do, a squad is basically just, Scrum team, right, at the end of the day. You have this idea of a chapter, right? I guess that's like a skill set across, right? We have collections of teams that deliver a single thing. Tribe, I think of like a guild as like a community of practice. So you start to see how it's kind of trying to hunt for these different aspects. We have the teams that can deliver together. All the things I just said about Scrum would apply at the squad level. We have mechanisms so people of like-minded disciplines can get together and understand things. Communities, so we have interest groups. We have collections so that we can produce. So what we're trying to figure out, right, as these models start to scale, we're trying to figure out constructs, I believe, so that the reds get what they want, the blues get what they want, the whites get what they want, and the yellows get what they want, right? But it's a more complex system, okay? Now, I put SAFE up there, right? SAFE gets a lot of blowback in the Agile community, but if you really just think about what Dean was trying to do with SAFE, it's really just like the way I think about SAFE is it's just a collections of teams that get together and kind of do release management and dependency management together, okay? And God, I got stories to tell, but I gotta go. So a lot of apparent complexity in the diagram, but at the end of the day, right, it's just teaming strategies, it's ways of dealing with collections of teams, it's just constructs to deal with all the same things that Scrum was fundamentally trying to deal with. Again, people will say, well, this ruins the culture. Well, yeah, kind of, but at scale, like the reds got to win, the whites got to win, the blues have to win. And so I think even in a SAFE environment, if you build SAFE right, it creates the context where the teams can have all the stuff that they need in that blue, yellow kind of a thing. And then we get big room planning, right? That creates, safety for the reds, safety for the whites, safety for the blues, safety for the yellows, right? So I see all of these methodologies as structures and frameworks that are trying to get everybody what they want. But I would still go back to so many organizations because of their technology infrastructures, dependencies. I actually have a slide on dependencies, right? The dependencies, it's like the core challenge is that we can't fundamentally get Scrum operating. So all the scaling frameworks in the absence of that core of Scrum, like they don't deliver, right? And so maybe the reds get what they want out of that, but the blues sure as heck don't. The whites might get some of what they want out of that, but I don't know that the yellows are getting what they want out of that, right? So it's really kind of interesting. So it's like, it goes back to this systems first thing. This is wow, I was clicking buttons and didn't even know. There's a lot of practices associated with this. There's a lot of roles, there's a lot of stuff associated with it. So what I tend to do, kind of like I'm doing with the personality stuff, is I tend to think through what are the underlying fundamental patterns that make all of this stuff work and make it all come together. And again, like I said, I won't go through this slide in detail either, but it's like the challenge to all of this at the end of the day for me is that our organizations have so many dependencies across them. And in the presence of dependencies, it's super hard to get that fundamental unit right. Maybe I will go through some of them, right? If we don't have enough people, right, we're sharing people across teams. That kind of breaks Scrum. If there's too much work in process, right, we're shoving things in the system and we're not letting teams establish stable velocity, sustainable pace. How do I create a Scrum team when I have a large product with really diverse technology stacks and lots of specialists and things like that? How do I organize for that in a way that allows me to build cross-functional Scrum teams? Architecture issues like cohesion and coupling, technical debt and defects, requirements that span across multiple teams, maybe like in a value stream or a business capability or something. Limited subject matter expertise, right? It just goes on and on, right? Matrixed organizations. Some of these things are imposed by the solutions architectures that we operate on top of. Some of them are imposed by the organizational designs. Some of them we just shoot ourselves in the foot and create dependencies because we don't see any other way to do it, but they're solvable, right? So sometimes there's intentional and unintentional kinds of dependencies that all get in the way of creating the organizations that we want so that we can get the culture that we'd like to have, okay? Because again, at the end of the day, safety is an interesting thing. We create safety when we're able to make and meet commitments. We create safety when everybody knows the rules. We create safety when we get to be connected to each other, and we create safety when we get to have fun together. This idea of psychological safety is big in the Agile community. So what are the conditions that have to be created so everybody gets the psychological safety that they need, all four of the different quadrants? So, one of the things that we think about, I'm not particularly a safe guy, but I think the way I think of safe is it's like a fundamental, it's like a reference implementation of a fundamentally true reference architecture. Anybody old enough or been around this industry long enough to understand RUP, Rational Unified Process? Yeah, so like Rational Unified Process just wasn't wrong per se, right? There's a lot of truth in what Rational Unified Process was trying to do, but what happens is that the industry demands that it be a thing. Same thing that's happened with SAFe, right? It has to be a thing, it has to be defined, it has to have rules, it has to have all these things. So what we do is we start to add so much to it, it just gets super overwhelming. Okay, so what I want to try to do is talk about some of the underlying patterns of organizations at scale and how they'll contribute to the kind of culture that you want. And so we think of organizations in sometimes 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5 layers, right? Kind of like SAFe has all those different levels of safeness. Right, what I put on this slide is this idea of like a services team or a component team, something that is like a shared object that the rest of the organization consumes, right? Think of like a service or an API, something like that. Business capability that a lot of different other capabilities consume. That's kind of what I mean by a services team. You can create Scrum teams around those kinds of services. Right? Then you have product teams. I consider like a product team something that consumes a service and maybe puts a front end around it. Way oversimplification, but you guys get the idea, right? It's just a simple pattern. And then we'll have something like a program team. Program team for me is something like that orchestrates requirements. It deals with the dependencies in the organization. A lot of times it grooms backlog ahead of when the teams actually get it, right? It deals with cross-cutting concerns. It deals with things that impact multiple teams. And then at the top, there's usually something like a portfolio team or an investment tier that establishes constraints for how the rest of the organization creates it. The first time I saw anything like this hypothesized was actually a Ken Schwaber talk probably about, again, I'm losing track, 12 years ago, something like that, where he showed like nested teams. They almost look like eggs, like in a pan or something, like fried eggs, like circles with circles, circles with circles, right? Kind of a thing. And kind of the general idea is that the higher levels within the organization, they're designed to create safety and boundaries, kind of create a container for the layers that are underneath them. Okay, it provides clarity, it provides structure, it provides, I would offer, even safety. Now, the way we think of organizations is kind of in a nested pyramid or a nested set of circles, stuff like that. Now, in order to deal with large, complex organizations, sometimes, again, in the presence of dependencies, in the presence of cross-cutting concerns, in the presence of scale, you have to start to think about the idea of what does an agile governance model look like. Anybody want to walk out when I say the word governance? No, I'm just kidding. So if you think about governance, right? Governance is just, in effect, how do we deal with making decisions when we don't have unlimited time and money or resources, right, to do everything that we would like to do. So at the delivery level, if you think about it, Scrum is a very simple, lightweight governance model. The product owner has responsibility for bringing the backlog. The team has responsibility for deciding how the work gets done. And then their responsibility is producing a working tested increment at the end of every sprint. Ideally, I would like to know the size of the backlog, I would like to know the velocity of the team, and I would like to be able to calculate time and cost, or how much scope I'm going to get if my time and cost is constrained, right? Just a super lightweight governance model that gives the teams rules for how they're going to operate. My general belief, to tie back to our kind of core theme here, is that if people are resisting, they're not getting something that they need out of the system. And so the system's out of balance. It could be because you have a leader that is used to operating in chaos and doesn't trust the system of delivery to produce the 10 times more that he has to do or she has to do than the system can actually produce. It is way safer in a lot of organizations to say yes to everything and fail than it is to bring the system into balance and to actually do what you say you're going to do. Right? So again, we can kind of go down this rabbit hole. It's like, I think that's why so many people in the Scrum world want to say like, oh, there's no sprint commitment. Oh, there's no this. We're just going to give these things to the team and they're going to kind of get it done when they get it done. Well, that's great for the low structure people. That's awful for the high structure people. Okay? So maybe what I could offer is go back and look at the system through this lens and ask yourself, what do you value versus what do the resistors in an organization value? And is the system able to give them what they want? Because I bet you there's a mismatch. Like I was talking to a young lady on the phone the other day who worked for this CIO, and I mean, she was such a true believer in this Agile stuff. But what she really cared about was kind of the process, the connection, all that stuff. And I can just imagine that CIO sitting there going, but like, when's my project going to be done? Right? And so if you've, maybe, again, don't know, right? If you've defined Agile as, well, I have teams and we're sprinting and collaborating and this is all great, but the reds aren't getting what they want, or the whites aren't getting what they want, then I would guess that's probably why you're having resistance. Just a thought. Okay, am I in? Okay, cool. So I nailed it, huh? Yeah. So you're okay, cool, awesome, excellent. Okay, cool. And something that sometimes we don't think about is, and this is I think our market, like this thing is evolving at this point, because at the end of the day, the business has to be successful, right? That's the top tier. Okay, we have to define success. We have to understand what that means. Then that has to be translated into initiatives. Those are smaller bets. That's the portfolio tier for me, right? So we're making bets that if we do these things, this will be achieved. Up underneath that, I need a decomposition layer, right? Where coordination and dependencies are either broken or managed. And then I need a really well-functioning Scrum team at the bottom. And the way I think about this, it's that idea of containers or containment. If I have really clear objectives at the top, really clear economic priorities, and I have a really clear set of prioritized initiatives at that portfolio tier, and I am systematically getting that work decomposed, okay? And really clear backlogs are being funneled down to the Scrum team so that the story ties to the feature, ties to the epic, ties to the ultimate business outcome, right? Now at the bottom layer, I have the teams that are operating, they can do perfect Agile, okay? They can fund, collaborate, intimacy, connection, make and meet commitments, follow the rules, right? All the personality profiles get taken care of. but that requires a functioning entity above them to set and hold that context, right? The people that are decomposing the work and dealing with the dependencies and forward planning the backlog, right? They have to have a clear set of priorities on top of them, right? And there's teams at each of these levels, right, that can all be collaborative and fun and intimate and get things done and hold themselves accountable and all those kinds of different things. But you've got to build a system that respects all those. I think sometimes what we do is, again, and this is, I'm kind of a contrarian in the Agile community here a little bit around this, is that you have this idea that Agile is about the more blue and the more yellow. And I think we need to figure out how to get the red and the white in there as well, right? And I think there's room for all four views, but if we sit and kind of hold on the fact that, well, it's only about collaboration, it's only about fun, and it's only about empowerment, and it's only about these things, you're gonna leave the rest of the organization out, okay? I'm gonna try to skid this one in here really quick, okay? So measurement and accountability is part of that. We're not going to be able to go with this in any depth, but it's like, you know, part of the challenge then becomes, right? So then you get the system of delivery going. It's like, what do you do with product management, the strategy guys, budgeting and funding, technology architecture, compliance and controls, your talent organization, your leadership? Because at the end of the day, it has to work for those folks too, okay? And so, you know, we created this little model a few years ago, did a little conference around it, where I think of organizational change management is really a fundamental set of steps. And getting back to my culture, practices, structure thing, I think that if you start to think about the system first, you enable the system with solid practices, you design it such that the cultural attributes that you desire across all four of the quadrants can emerge within that framework. We look holistically across all of the different pieces. That's where you get in this concept of we have to figure out how to get there. Okay, so our model is like, there's a lot you can do to start to stabilize the system in place, right? To get it fundamentally functioning and performing. You can start to reduce batch size. You can start to break dependencies. I go back to dependencies. My team actually created a little meme around me. You guys, anybody watch Ancient Aliens? You know that guy, Georgios Tsoukalos? You know, there's this meme that was going around that said, like, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. You know what I'm talking about? Well, so they made that a picture of me like that, and one of my content guys goes, I'm not saying it's dependencies, but it's dependencies. Okay? Dependencies. That's what makes all of this stuff hard. Right? So you guys will have to make choices in your organizations about what dependencies you're going to break. And then if you don't break the dependencies, how are you going to manage them? Right? Your system has to account for the dependencies. Once dependencies are broken, we can start to do team-based funding and, you know, give people more space. And then the last thing is like invest to learn. I think about that as like lean startup. If you're going that far and you really desire Agile to be in this space where the teams are working with customers and A/B testing and figuring out markets and all those kinds of things, conditions have to be created for that. Okay? And then again, I'm just blowing through this stuff here. I apologize, I'm running a little bit late. There's like organizational stuff, that wheel that I just kind of glossed over. Like you've got to figure out how to tie all those other folks in at some point. And you got to think, the finance people have a really different view of what's important than maybe engineering leadership versus maybe your project managers versus maybe your business analysts versus your developers, right? So the systems that we create have to account for all of them. And the one thing I would encourage is that transformation is a change management activity, and it has to be done incrementally and iteratively, right? So don't think like I have this utopian view of what the organization is going to look like, and I'm going to train everybody, and I'm going to teach them about the culture and do all these different things, and then everything's going to work. Because what I'm experiencing is that works for, I don't think the people that are in the blue-yellow area are really getting what they want out of it. And I know for a fact the people that are white or red and white aren't getting what they want out of it. And I think our failure to address culture holistically is causing a lot of chaos sometimes. right? So that's kind of another key point. Transformation and change management is an incremental and iterative process. It's kind of like elephant carpaccio that Alistair Coburn talks about, or taking the elephant one bite at a time, right? You have to have a strategy for thinking about how are we going to build these structures, install these practices, let this culture emerge, but do it systematically so that everybody like truly understands it, right? So back to my original slides, right? I don't know if in 45 minutes I made the strongest case ever. I had way more stories to tell you guys. But this idea of creating a fundamental structure, and systems I think of as structure, what's our teaming strategy, governance, what's our orchestration strategy, and then metrics, how are we going to measure, right? That's what I mean by systems in aggregate. How are we going to create practices around those that enable that system? And then can we create a system that deals holistically with all the different aspects of culture that are important to people? Because you're not going to get somebody like me who's a red-yellow to fundamentally think like a blue-white. I have 30 years of experience trying to figure out how to make that happen. And at the end of the day, what you are ultimately trying to do is you're trying to build systems with an awareness of the different cultural aspects that the different people in your organization value, especially if you're an organization at scale. And I think it's a really powerful lens to think through, kind of to the gentleman in the red's question, is what we've built, is it satisfying all of the different constituents in the organization? And if not, what can we do with integrity in an Agile ecosystem to incrementally and iteratively create those conditions?